Hi, everybody. So excited to have you join us today. Welcoming you in to talk a little bit about graphic novel adaptations. Really excited to be joined by this amazing crew of panelists today from all across different publishers and with different books out. And we're just going to talk about some really amazing titles today and to learn a little bit about how each of these creators kind of approaches adaptation. So to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit of this presentation we put together. So hopefully you've joined us today to participate in License to Thrill graphic novel adaptations. So these are some of the amazing books up top that we're going to be talking about today by the amazing panelists we have in store. Those panelists are Sabaa Tahir. She has written A Thief Among the Trees and Ember in the Ashes graphic novel. So she is joined by James Otis Smith, who wrote Black Heroes of the Wild West, R. Sikoryak, who we'll be calling Bob today, who did Constitution Illustrated, and David Bowles, who has The Halfling King coming out. And again, we're talking today about graphic novel adaptations and the amazing titles that we have in front of us. So I am Adam Kohlberg. I will be moderating your session today, so you'll see and hear a lot from me. So I apologize and appreciate you in advance. And I also want to give a shout out to Children's Book Council, especially the Graphic Novel Committee, who are sponsoring this panel. And I want to thank San Diego Comic-Con as well for offering us this opportunity to provide some virtual content. I want to give everyone kind of a look at our panelists today, and then we're going to go through individual introductions so we can all give a quick wave and a hello. Yeah. And we'll hear from them shortly. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into some introductions here and let you get to know these folks a little bit more, and then we'll talk a little bit more about their books. So first up on the docket is Cartoonist R. Sikoryak. He's the author of Masterpiece Comics, Terms and Conditions, and The Unquotable Trump. He adapts the classics for various anthologies, including the Graphic Canon, Fable Comics, and more. His comics and illustrations have appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times book section, The Nation, The Onion, Mad, SpongeBob Comics. He's also been featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He's done storyboards and character designs for Augenblick Studios on various animated projects. And he also teaches at the illustration department at Parsons The New School for design, and previously at the Center for Cartoon Studies. So since 1997, he's presented his live cartoon slideshow series, Carousel, around the United States and Canada. He currently lives in New York with his wife, Kriota Willberg, and really exciting things. You'll see Constitution is Illustrated up the top right of this slide, and that comes out next week into stores. So with that, I will give him a chance to say hello in person.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Excited to chat. All right. Next up on our list is, right here, Sabaa Tahir. So she is the author of An Ember in the Ashes series. She grew up in California's Mojave Desert at her family's 18-room hotel, which sounds like lots of interesting stories there. There, she spent her time devouring fantasy novels, raiding her brother's comic book stash, and playing guitar badly. She began writing while working as a newspaper editor. She likes thunderous indie rock, we're on the same page there, garish socks, and all things nerd. So this is Sabaa's first graphic novel collaboration, and what you see here is the graphic novel adaptation, A Thief Among the Trees, that's based around her really exciting and definitely the prose version, check that out. But this graphic novel adaptation is also really exciting. So with that, I'll let her give her a little hello.
Hello, thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone watching.
Excellent. All right. Next up, we have David Bowles. So David Bowles is an award-winning Mexican-American author and translator, as well as an associate professor of literature and Nahuatl. I'm maybe saying that wrong.
That's right. Nahuatl, yeah.
Model at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, fellow Texan, hello. He has written over 20 books. So those include Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, Myths of Mexico, Flower, Song, Dance, Aztec, and Maya Poetry. This September, we'll see the release of his graphic novel, Rise of the Halfling King, which you'll see kind of featured here on the slide. And so Kirkus has called that an unmissable adventure of mythical proportions. So all sounds very exciting. Looking forward to hearing about it today. Next spring, the first volume in his steampunk graphic novel series, Clockwork Curandera, will drop. David's work has also been published in multiple anthologies and in venues like School Library Journal, Apex, Strange Horizons, Rattle, Translation Review, and the Journal of Children's Literature. In 2017, David was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. So congratulations, David. And I will let him say hello.
Hola, how's everybody doing? Glad you're here. Excited to be on this panel.
Right, and last but certainly not least, we have James Otis Smith. Oh, wrong scroll, there we go. So James Otis Smith is the author of the upcoming Black Heroes of the Wild West, to be released by Toon Books in September of 2020. It will be his first book as both author and illustrator. So previously he had adapted Showtime at the Apollo by music writer Ted Fox as a graphic novel. He's also worked as a production artist for independent movies, but missing that straightforward honesty of ink on paper, he's returned to his first love, comics. So as a childhood fan of old serials and classic American pop culture, he has long hoped to reclaim those stories and expand who and what we mean when we talk about America. And I think this is a perfect book to start that discussion. So that's awesome. And I will let him say hello.
Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here. This is my first time doing SDCC, and I'm glad to see that it looks a lot like my apartment.
So
James, you have the best picture. You look like a comic book hero in your picture. The rest of us look kind of boring, to be honest.
Yeah, I feel like a letdown if you see my picture and then you meet me.
No. Matches up.
you look like a man of mystery. I'm not sure what's going on, you know.
Yeah, totally gonna steal the whole vibe. Yes.
Yeah. Let's pull it up again just to make sure that everybody got a chance to see this amazing headshot. Yes, there it is. Very good stuff. I like the black beanie with the black background personally. I think it's a nice touch.
I feel like a private detective.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I have a slide for myself, but it doesn't seem like I need to kind of show myself on a slide. I'm right here. So my name's Adam Kohlberg. I work for a nonprofit based out of Denver. We're called Pop Culture Classroom. We are dedicated to basically helping bring graphic novels, board games, video games, whatever under the sun you can think of related to pop culture into classrooms and communities as a tool to help kids stay engaged and learn new things. And so, you know, I was really happy to be asked to moderate this panel. And again, I'm really excited to chat. And I think these books really speak to the power of pop culture as an educational tool and a way to kind of get kids invested and involved in everything from history to social issues to, you know, what the future might look like, which I think, you know, today more than ever are discussions that we need to have. All right, so I wanted to go ahead and just get started with our discussion because I know that's what folks here are hungry for. So I thought we would kind of start off going around today just with basically your general thoughts on why graphic novel adaptations are important, why we're seeing more adaptations being published today. I think that, you know, a person to start with this question is someone who's been maybe immersed in this culture and these creations for a long time now. So this is Bob, obviously, who's been doing some of this work. And so the question I would ask for you is why do you think that this is becoming more and more present today? And how do you think that graphic novel adaptations kind of bring a thrill? That's the point of this panel, right? Talking about the thrill of adaptations. How do you bring that to the surface? And while, you know, you kind of get started on that, I want to just show our audience here just like a sample of how you take something as might be simple and straightforward as the Constitution and turn it into an action-packed adventure. So I'm gonna share this screen so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. And if you wanna just kind of jump in and kind of talk a little bit toward that question.
Okay, well, I think the embrace of comics as a learning tool over the last maybe 20 years has been really exciting. The way libraries and even bookstores have embraced the graphic novel as a category has certainly encouraged people to work in that field. And I think those of us who love comics are happy to have a space where our work is welcome. I have always been doing adaptations of classic literature or other famous texts. It was always something that was interesting to me. There's a long history of that in comics, going back to the 1940s, maybe most famously with Classics Illustrated, which was a very well-meaning but stodgy comic book that retold classic literature. And I think what's happened differently today is that people who are excited by the work they're adapting are making the adaptations. I think initially a lot of the adaptations were done because people thought, oh, this is good for kids, we should do this. And I think sometimes that work was maybe too reverent or earnest and could feel a little stodgy. And I think the work that's being done now is much more diverse and is coming from different angles and then looking at the classics in different ways, and even lesser known works that are worthy of being adapted into other media. So I'm excited that comics are, I feel like finally, really embraced by people as a form where people can really reinvent a text in a different medium.
Yeah.
I like this idea of not being overly reverential when you're adapting something, even if it's something that is, sacred or important or revered or whatever. But graphic novel adaptations allow you to make it a little more accessible, to maybe poke fun at it a little bit, or play with it in ways that are going to, especially when you're writing for young people, as Bob's suggesting, and as somebody who writes for young people, I think about this all the time. Kids love to see authority deflated a little bit. They love to see adults fall on their faces, or for something to go awry. It gives them a sense of like, okay, my powerlessness in the world isn't quite as bad as having power and being inept at using it. So I think that graphic novels really lend themselves to those kinds of explorations.
Mm-hmm. James or Sabaa, did you have anything you wanted to add there? Kind of about your own way of kind of creating that sense of thrill. I'm kind of curious to see if when you were handed like an adaptation project, you said, no, or I can't wait. I think you're muted, James.
Yeah. I found in my experience that people are most excited by recognizing themselves in the work. So, for instance, when I was doing the Apollo book, people that had experience with the Apollo were were the ones who were most excited, or people that knew the history of the Apollo. And then with the Western, it kind of works the same way. Obviously, there's no one that was alive at that time, but people that are familiar with the material seem to be the ones who are most excited about a new representation of that material.
So Thief is my first graphic novel, so I definitely don't have the experience that my fellow panelists do, but I feel like graphic novels are just a medium that have allowed me to explore things that prose doesn't really allow for. The type of prose that I write is definitely very plot driven, and that means that there are occasionally things that get a little bit lost or that sort of fade to the background. And one of the joys of working on A Thief Among the Trees was actually just the visuals and seeing them, and particularly the setting and the surrounding, and getting to really ground the characters in that, and allow that to sort of speak for their actions and why they were doing certain things. And you have that in prose, but for some reason this was a little bit more, it was more visceral through comic books, or through the graphic novels. So I think that that's really special. And I agree with Bob that it is, you know, comics as a learning tool is an incredible thing. My son wouldn't read books. He started with graphic novels, and once he got used to them and got comfortable with them, that's when he was able to pick up a prose book and read it. But he was refusing to read them until he had gotten through some graphic novels and was like, oh, this really built up my confidence. So
yeah, I think one really amazing thing about graphic novels is it gives you that, you know, I think we kind of circled around this idea, that sense of direct connection with a character who you can kind of pull them from the history books or pull them from your imagination, show their facial expressions, their body movements, the world that they live in. And so that's a really powerful way, I think, to kind of give, especially kids, but I think any reader, a sense of like engagement and feel like they're immersed in that world, right? So I think that's kind of what I see as like the power of graphic novels as a whole, but especially adaptations of, you know, prose or you know, nonfiction type experiences or texts. So yeah, and I think that kind of leads into the next question as well. You know, like we talked a little bit about the final product, right? Like kind of how the impact is and why you think that these graphic novel adaptations are really something that kids can sink their teeth into and have a really high engagement these days. So, you know, one of the things I wanted to ask specifically to James was, you know, I'm curious about the creative process around an adaptation. And I'm curious about if it's different than other projects that you've worked on that are non-adaptation, because I'll share the screen really quickly, but, you know, when you're relying on historical artifacts, on historical images, you know, how does that kind of frame your sense of responsibility to the subject matter, or and also your process of representing those characters? So as you kind of get started on that, I'll definitely share the screen so folks can see what I mean. There's some really amazing kind of 3-part images here of like the original character historically, what they wore, and then kind of the representation in your book.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never intended to, but I find myself doing a lot of nonfiction books at the moment. And so I have the experience, including the book that I'm working on at the moment, I have the experience of working on recent history, long dead history, and people that are currently living. And I do feel a sense of responsibility, especially to the people that are currently living, obviously. And that's when you get into the problem of like getting the likenesses down, which I'm not great at, and I spend a lot of time on that. But the way that I tend to work is, I think, trying to think of the best way to put this. I think that I would like it to be, I would like it to be real more than right. In other words, I want it to feel appropriate, but it doesn't like, I personally don't care about whether the gun is exactly accurate, but I want it to feel like this is a gun that a person at that time would be using. So I think a lot of, I think the term, the original Superman movie, actually, they used to talk about how Richard Donner would go around the set using the word verisimilitude all the time. And the idea was, obviously this isn't real, but it has to feel real. And that's what I tend to focus on more than anything else. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's great. It kind of reminds me of filmmaking, that idea of, you know, creating that there's FX, there's, you know, the scraping of a shoe on a, you know, all these things that go into creating I forget the word for it, but it's like the atmosphere to make people feel included in that space, even if it's a soundstage. I feel like that's kind of what, you know, it's not the actual sound of a shoe scraping, it's somebody whittling together 2 pieces of wood, but it still feels real and it makes you feel present tense, right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly, yeah. The danger with comics is that if you put too much detail in there, it'll be accurate, but it'll kill the art on the page. So you really want to just get the sense across and then try to have as much work being done in the mind of the reader as possible.
That's the same kind of dilemma that Charlene and I came up against. When, we're adapting a legend that's set 1,000 years ago in a Maya city-state in the Yucatan Peninsula, and though those ruins still exist, and so we know like what the physical structures look like, and most likely what their colors were, because they're still like fragments of paint and stuff like that on the stone. We don't have a clear understanding of the way like commoners dressed, and we have some notion of, within several hundred years of that time period, the way nobles dressed or whatever, but there's just no way of being perfectly accurate, and so you kind of go for consistency and like James was saying, like this sense of what's real for that story, so that people are reading it and they're enveloped by it and caught up in it. And yes, that's going to mean that some stickler for historical accuracy will look at it and go, oh, that headdress is from 1500 in Chichen Itza and not in this city. But you're writing for an audience that isn't expert in these things, just to open their minds up and get them to be thrilled and excited about this period of time or this type of story, and then they can delve into the complexities of the story on their own.
That's great. Yeah. I'm kind of interested in how Sabaa and like Bob, how you feel about like this idea of real versus right, and where you fall on that kind of sense when you're thinking about a graphic novel.
So when I was writing An Ember in the Ashes, I was basing it off of ancient Rome. And one of the concepts in ancient Rome were the concepts of these families, which were called gens. And the plural of gens is gentes. And I had to like decide whether I wanted to be like really super accurate about how I modified these words, right? And ultimately I decided, you know what, I'm just going to leave it gens singular and gens is plural, because I don't really want my readers to have to like make that translation in their head when they're already sinking into this world. And I sort of feel that the same way about images. So I kind of agree with what David and James are saying, is that I don't think that you always have to be like right on exactly accurate. I think that sometimes doing that can take away from the story. And to me, it's fiction a lot of times, right? For me, it's fiction. So the goal is to get everyone immersed in the story. And if it's not fiction, if it's nonfiction, as in what James is writing, what you end up seeing a lot, then the goal is still to get you immersed in the nonfiction, right? And so if something is slightly off, but it's more visually interesting, or it allows for something else that's really important to shine on the page, that's cool.
I feel the same way. I understand what everybody's saying here. I think it's true. I think there's you say what's real and what's I forget what the other term was, but the right versus the real. In all of my comics, I'm always juxtaposing the text with images that evoke different comics characters. So in the images you saw earlier, there was like a Superman one, there was a Dykes to Watch Out For one. The characters are dressed in the garb that people would be wearing in the time the Constitution was written, but your mind is taken out of that by the fact that here's Superman and here's an Alison Bechdel character. And you sort of have to juggle all these things in your head. I think what happens when you're reading it, it's the same as when you're watching a movie where Cate Blanchett is playing the Queen of England. It's like, you know it's Cate Blanchett, but you're sucked into the story and you can accept her for the length of the film. You can accept her as the queen in that era, but you're always aware that it's her. And I like a reader or a viewer sort of having to sort of juggle that idea, because I think that's part of what adaptations are about. You're bringing the past into the present, or you're bringing a fiction into reality. And I think having the reader recognize that all the pieces don't fit perfectly is kind of interesting, and it kind of keeps them on their toes. I certainly am interested when people can do that, where they can lure me in, but I'm still kind of aware of the craft of the story and the care that they take in telling it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think I really like that idea, and it kind of brings up this like weird sort of reference in my mind is the movie A Knight's Tale. Does any of you remember this movie? And like it's about like mid-century England. Heath Ledger is the main, but they have all this really great like musical pieces in there. It's like Queen and these modern touches, and you have people like doing modern breakdancing, and so it didn't seem to matter to the movie, and it actually made it a little bit better. It like brought out some of the like almost like just some of the fun and some of the wonkiness almost of a little bit of like the culture of the time. So I think of that too when I think of kind of that approach. Well, cool. I think this actually segues really nicely into the kind of next question. I know, David, you had brought up basically like the challenges of accurately representing, the time period that you're drawing a lot of these stories from. And I was wondering, like, for you specifically, kind of looking back so far in history and pulling a lot of this out of like anecdotal, like oral storytelling practices, what's been the other challenges that you've faced? And then maybe we can all kind of see if we relate to those as a group and kind of share those same struggles, or if there's ones that, other people have had that they want to share as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share kind of some examples from your book, just from the interior. So you're welcome to jump in there.
Yeah, totally. So the Rise of the Halfling King is the first in a series of 10 graphic novel adaptations of legends and myths from my book Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, which was written for an older audience, did really well, received some really great reviews and won some awards. And the publisher asked whether I would be up to doing graphic novel adaptations for a younger group, for middle grade, upper elementary, and middle school kids. And I was definitely down for it. But the challenge, becomes how to translate something I've already adapted or translated from a pre-Columbian text or oral tradition into this visual medium. And so we're going through several layers. So for this particular story, in the book, it's called The Dwarf King of Uxmal. It's a very, very famous legend from southern Mexico that was recorded for the first time in English and Spanish in the 1800s, but had already, been orally transmitted for hundreds of years before that. And so in retelling a story, I went back and read those two written, like translated accounts where somebody had been told the story by a Yucatec Mayan informant, and then they had like translated into English in one case and Spanish in the other, and kind of like let those two versions of the story filter through. And then I found a couple of variants that had maybe not been recorded word for word, but that had been summarized in different texts. And then I actually went to the states of Yucatan and Quintana Roo, the two Mexican states on the peninsula, and just went to some of the places and talked to people and asked older people from like Mayan communities down there, did you ever hear the story of the Dwarf King of Uxmal? In Spanish, I would tell them, ¿ha oído el cuento del Rey Enano de Uxmal? And they would go, oh, yes. And sometimes they would say, but I only know it in Yucateco. And so I would record it because I've studied Yucateco, but I'm not particularly good at having a conversation. And then I would get somebody to help translate it. And so the version of the story that was in the book was like this blend of historical versions of the story layered with the texture that I'd gotten from some of these oral informants. But when I had to adapt it to the graphic novel, like a straight up graphic novel adaptation of the story, like beat for beat, just wouldn't have worked. It would have fallen flat. There wouldn't have been the kind of flair. I needed to introduce other characters. I needed there to be a mechanism for the main character to express certain ideas, and so he came up with the idea of his having a spider monkey friend named Mosh, which is great. The word Mosh just means spider monkey, and you can take my, it's kind of cute, and it looks like Max. And I worked with Charlene to try to come up with ways to visually convey like the magic that he's able to use, that he learns from the witch who raises him, because he's born out of an egg. He's like half Alush, which is a kind of elf-like creature, and half human, born out of an egg. And so we tried to find ways to visually represent that. And then at some point we realized that story that I had wasn't enough. The needed sequence, we needed our big like Indiana Jones escaping from the Rolling Stone kind of moment. And so in some of those alternate versions of the story, I found a variant where the dwarf king, where the halfling king has to fight this massive snake from the underworld. And so we amped that up and incorporated it in. And so, on the slide you showed right now, there you can see the giant underworld snake attacking the main character. Ultimately, I think the work that we did tells the story, goes beyond the edges of the story to like suggest and creatively play around with some of the themes and ideas in the story in ways that maybe the original storytellers didn't, but that I think a modern audience will respond to. And that's always tricky, but I think it's worthwhile because the original stories always exists, and any child or adult who becomes interested in learning more about it from reading the graphic novel can dig into those original sources that are readily available on the internet, most of them.
That's great. I like that idea of like kind of sparking their interest, and then they have this kind of rabbit hole to go down, in terms of, getting excited, and, the stories open up in a way once you kind of deliver them in this different format. And you're like, wait, that's, I can kind of see it in my head now. I can see how these folks interacted and looked. So that's great. Do any of the other panelists, do you have, shared challenges, experiences, like especially around adaptations, and kind of, things that have come up for you that you weren't expecting?
Well, a thing that comes up for me a lot is I like to say that I don't really have great commercial instincts, and that's why I like to have a good editor, because my tendency will always be towards entertaining myself and forgetting. Sometimes it can be easy to forget what other people need, especially in a nonfiction subject where there are ways to make it more entertaining, but you may start to veer out of the educational zone and more into the entertainment zone. And so I find myself having to rein my more action-oriented instincts in a little bit, It's kind of the pitfall of growing up on superhero comic books.
You want it to be like fantastic, but you have to kind of like scaffold it back down to like the real story kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. Like when I started with the on the Apollo book, I was definitely pushing more for let's combine some of these less important people into like one person that could tell you XYZ, and it's like, well, no, these were actual people, so let's just put them in the book, and yeah, it wasn't a fight so much as just reorienting the way I was thinking of the stories to make them both entertaining but historically accurate.
Yeah, that's great. I think it also kind of lends to this discussion that I wanted to have. I think especially Sabaa and Bob, like y'all both have very well-known text, that are famous either politically, as the Constitution or like the Apple Terms and Agreement, or if for example, Sabaa, you have #1 New York Times best-selling books that you have an audience for, and they have expectations, right? So I was wondering if we could start with Sabaa and just kind of hear a little bit about how you feel the audience reaction plays into your discussion, and then Bob, jump in and talk about a little bit about, especially today with the election looming, like political stuff, it's all wrapped in kind of this larger context. So I'm curious to see how you address that and kind of, maybe address that challenge, or maybe it's an opportunity, I'm not sure.
Sure. So Thief Among the Trees is actually not an adaptation. It is a prequel. So it isn't, but it is an adaptation of a world. And I think that is what made it so complex. So we had thought, my graphic novel publisher and I had thought maybe we should do an adaptation of Ember, but Ember is a really big book, and it's very complex, and there's multiple points of view, and we just sort of felt like that kind of adaptation might be pretty difficult. So I had all these ideas for, what happened to these characters when they were younger, and Boom Studios was totally down with adapting those concepts. So, I did an outline, and then it was actually scripted by Nicole Andelfinger, who was incredible. And we really did have to stop and think, okay, people have certain expectations of how characters act, certain expectations of how characters look, certain expectations of the world. And I think that, we tried to upend some of those. So much of the first book takes place in the desert, and this story takes place in more of a jungle setting. The first books sort of focus on a few different characters, and this one focuses on one of the main characters, but when he was much younger, and kind of his world. And it really is meant to pinpoint a moment in his life where things changed for him. And so in that regard, we sort of stepped away from what reader expectations might be and just said, you know what? Let's make this story how we want to make it. Let's tell, I am going to tell the stories the way I've always told them, which is, what do I think would actually happen? So for all of my books, I try not to think about the readers, because otherwise that's going to influence what I write, and I don't want that. I want to just be able to tell the story. So that was very much the same here. And I think that Sonia Lau, who did the art on the book, had a really great and deep understanding of how the characters looked and how the world looked, but she also brought her own kind of interpretation of the world of Ember to this, and that's what made it so great. That's what made it interesting. I didn't want to walk in there being like, no, this exact thing isn't right. Sort of like what we were talking about before about being precise or not being precise. I think it's important. I think what makes graphic novels such a cool medium is that you really do have multiple people's perspective, and they're somehow married and joined into this one beautiful piece of art. And we get to see each person's touch within that piece of art. And that's really what I hope people see in Thief as well. And that's what we were trying to do. So hopefully readers enjoy it and they like it. But I kind of think it's you will always find your audience, right? So maybe it's not the exact audience that you thought it was going to be, but someone out there is going to look at this and be like, oh man, that's for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Bob, did you have any follow-up on there?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think that's I think Sabaa, you made a great comment about letting the audience find it, or finding the audience, or letting the audience recognize what's made for them. As someone who's been in comics a long time, I feel the urge to want to chase an audience, but sometimes you have to follow what you want to do yourself. I actually, in terms of where my book sort of fits into the political situation where we're at now, I very deliberately made my version of the Constitution not reflect just the moment. I had done a book on Trump a couple of years ago. I was very upset and kind of got all my agitation and fury out with that book, and I didn't want to talk about something that was just of the moment. Again, I wanted to do something a little bit more universal, hopefully. And as far as what Sabaa said about different voices kind of coming together in one book, even though I didn't have any collaborators on this book, what I've done is each page is in the style of a different artist. All of my work is revolved around parody and homage of different artists. So what I tried to do for the Constitution was really sort of reflect the history of American comics, comic books, and cartoons and comic strips. So each page is in the style of a different American artist, going from like 1895 to 2020. I have very young artists in there that I've parodied, and long gone famous classic cartoonists. And I'm hoping that that sort of tapestry is enough to let people in somehow. Like, they'll recognize one character they know. People might gravitate toward one page rather than the other. But I think what I tried to do was sort of express the American idea of the melting pot, and sort of like let all of these different voices in comics kind of all come together to illustrate or represent the Constitution. It's a big idea. I don't know if that answers your question, but there you go.
No, I love the egalitarian approach to, you know, a constitution. It almost like matches, you know, the format matches the content, right? Like, it's very
right. At least the ideal.
Yeah.
The ideal of the content. Yes.
Yes, the ideal, not necessarily always the implementation.
Right. Right.
Well, that's great. We are about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of start to wrap us up, but we're gonna have a chance to kind of hear about a couple things from y'all. I want to put some things on your radar. I'll kind of show where we can get your books and where we can get in touch with y'all. And then I wanted to end with you just letting us know, first, what are you working on? You know, what have you got in the hopper that you really are excited to share with the audience here? And then what would be your dream adaptation? I want to hear kind of like the dream that you might have for the future. Maybe any publishers who are listening will be able to reach out and be like, let's do this. So while you're thinking about that, I'm going to go ahead and share kind of where we can get these titles, these amazing titles that we have talked about today, and where we can learn a little bit more about each of you. So put on your thinking caps, and I'll kind of let people see this for a second, and then we'll kind of get wrapped up. But again, appreciate everybody's insights, and just being part of this experience has been really fun. So while they think and ponder, I wanted just to make sure that, you know, attendees who are kind of watching us today know that these books are available. They're either forthcoming, you can pre-order, or they're available now. You know, here's the links where you can actually look not only for these books, but other books by the publishers who are putting them out there. And I would definitely highly recommend you pick these up as soon as possible, because they are some amazing titles that need to be added to your library. So give that a quick minute for folks to take a photo or write this down. And finally, I just wanted to share out kind of ways that we can stay in touch. My email is listed here. We have some Instagram social media links, but we also have some websites here. So go ahead and take a quick photo of this, write it down, and make sure you reach out and let these folks know how, you know, how you like the panel, questions you might have, as well as, you know, just, you know, anything on your mind. So, and feel free to reach out to me too. I'm always happy to chat. So we'll return to the group. And now it is the closing hour, the witching bells ringing. So I wanted to go kind of around in no particular order. You share what you're working on, what's exciting, what's on next, and then what would be your dream adaptation if you could dream it up. So why don't we go ahead and start with James, and then we'll kind of just circle around.
I get to say, I've never said this before, but I can't tell you the next thing I'm working on. But it's a nonfiction book with Boom, and that's about a musician. And yeah, that's about all I can say right now. I'm also going to be doing a follow-up to Black Heroes of the Wild West with Toon, but that doesn't really have a date yet. In terms of adaptation, well, I don't know what I would want to do, but I do know that I have an interest in economics if you can be interesting when you're talking about economics. So if there's anyone out there who wants to do an entertaining graphic novel explaining how money works, you have one buyer, and I bet you have some more.
I know the guy you want.
Really?
His name is Ramit Sethi, and he's in Silicon Valley, and he is the first person whose work I read where I completely understood everything he was talking about when he spoke about finances and economics. He's just fantastic. You should talk to him.
Wait. Here's the test. Did you still understand it after you closed the book?
Yes.
Oh, great.
That was what was so great about it. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, already things in the mix. This is great. I love it. The fires are raging, creative fires. David, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about where you're at and what you got on your dream list?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in terms of just like illustrated output, because I'm also like a novelist and so forth, I've got coming from HarperCollins in 2 weeks of a chapter book series called 13th Street. That's for like young readers, and it's really wonderfully illustrated by Shane Clester, who does a lot of really great like Star Wars and Marvel work for young readers. Then, of course, there's this Tales of the Feathered Serpent, the first volume in 10 that'll be coming out over the next few years. And then, as you mentioned, my Clockwork Curandera series, illustrated by Raul Gonzalez III, which launches, it's a 3-volume series, and it launches next year. As far as things that I would love to adapt, I mean, I just feel like I'm already adapting so many of the things that I love to adapt, like adapting the Popol Vuh, the Mayan, that Mayan epic is something that who wouldn't want to do if they're interested in that sort of thing. And it's part of what we're doing with Tales of the Feathered Serpent. So I'm all good.
Got your dream stuff already in the mix. That's great. Great. So how about we do Bob, and then we'll finish with Sabaa?
Yes. So my next project, I hope, will be my the follow-up to my book Masterpiece Comics, which adapted 12 different literary classics in the style of different comics. I'm about a third of the way through that. It's a very long process, and I'm hoping that will be my next book that comes out. Part of that book will be an adaptation I've been grappling with for over 10 years, which is a version of Moby Dick, which has really daunted me. And the fact that Herman Melville never recovered after he published it is probably part of the reason that I'm also a little frozen in terms of finishing it myself. But that's an amazing book. And I actually collect adaptations of Moby Dick. I'm always interested in seeing other people who've adapted it, because it's a book that can't be adapted, which is one of the great things about it.
It is the white whale of adaptations, right? There we go, full circle.
So I'm currently working on one book, which is A Sky Beyond the Storm, which is the 4th book in the Ember and the Ashes series. And then I'm also working on the next graphic novel for Boom that is also from the world of Ember and the Ashes, which I'm very excited about, but I really can't say more than that. As far as what I like, my dream adaptation, this isn't something that I would adapt, but what I would love to see adapted. I would love to see The Beautiful by Renee Attier adapted. It's an 1800s vampire, inclusive, diverse vampire story, which is fantastic. I would love to see Nick Stone's Dear Martin adapted. It's just a wonderful book. I would die to see The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. It's an incredible book, and to see like a graphic novel adaptation of that would be awesome. So a lot of young adult books that I think would translate just so beautifully to graphic novels. Those are the 3 that I'm thinking about.
Great. Well, I think that kind of wraps everything up. I will share I'm a huge Toni Morrison and Kurt Vonnegut fan. So any book, any adaptation that can get out there, like that needs to happen. So I would say I'd love to be involved. So, you know, if you're out there, publishers, you know, just hit me up. I have no credentials at all, but I'm happy to to do something. But I wanted to just take one more moment to thank everybody for being part of this panel. Thank Children's Book Council for setting it up, and thank San Diego Comic-Con for hosting us. It's been a really amazing conversation, and I just appreciate everybody kind of being willing to share and celebrate these amazing books. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending.